Give us a sense of, you left rates on hold. You've got a lot of challenges in the medium and the short term to deal with given the pandemic. Give us a sense of the thinking of your Monetary Policy Committee.
Rishaad, it's a pleasure to be with you and your viewers this morning. The Monetary Policy Committee met on Friday, and it essentially made 3 points. The first is that the monetary stance right now in Pakistan is significantly accommodative. Our policy rate is 7%, and depending upon your measure of inflation, whether backward-looking, forward-looking, headline or core, real interest rates range from about 0 to -4 currently. The second key point was that the Monetary Policy Committee decided to leave rates unchanged. And the key considerations behind this decision was, one, uncertainties related to COVID, and number two, the factors that have increased the headline inflation recently primarily pertain to energy and food prices, which are likely to be one-off. The third key point, Rishaad, from the meeting of the Monetary Policy Committee pertained to forward guidance. And the committee was of the view that in the absence of unforeseen circumstances, the current significantly accommodative stance would be maintained. If there are any signs of emerging demand side pressure, then the committee may decide to moderate the extent of current accommodation.
Naturally.
But even in that circumstance, any changes would be measured and gradual. Just taking a step back, Rishaad, and I'll close on this question. The MPC is of the view that in the current uncertainties with COVID, a virus that is mutating, ravaging emerging markets, it's more dangerous to withdraw stimulus too soon rather than too late.
Absolutely, and I think that's the thinking, generally speaking, for central banks around the world. But do you need more help from the government, as it were, on the fiscal side here? You've had some dispersal of cash. Do you need more, and what shape or form should this take?
Pakistan's cash transfer program, the Asas Emergency Cash Transfer Program, has been recognized by international agencies, including the World Bank, as one of the global successes. The World Bank noted that it was amongst the top 4 programs in terms of the number of people reached, and amongst the top 3 global programs in terms of the share of population reached. But this program was one of 3 core elements of the government's strategy to deal with COVID. The very first element, Rishaad, was that in 3 successive waves, the government has been able to bring down the number of COVID cases. Currently, for every million of population, Pakistan has about 12 new cases as of yesterday. That compares to a global average of 62 new cases per million. Just some other examples, Brazil has 375 new cases per million of population. So the first point actually is the successful, repeated ability of the government to bring down the number of cases, then the emergency cash program, and finally, the extensive monetary stimulus that was given by the central bank, coming to around 5% of GDP, while at the same time, fiscal policy was prudent. Pakistan is one of those few countries in the world, according to IMF World Economic Outlook numbers, where public debt to GDP remained broadly unchanged in 2020 over the previous year.
Governor, I'd like to take a look at the growth forecast. We have pretty much the government forecasting 3.9% growth, Central Bank looking at 3%. Why do you think there is this upside surprise, and what's your projection for the coming year?
The central bank forecast of 3% predated the most recent data release and our current projection after seeing the data, particularly on farm output, because agriculture is a big part of our economy. Our revised forecast for this year is also 3.9. And this comes upon a combination of 2 factors, Haslinda. The first is, as I was mentioning earlier, a very aggressive central bank stimulus of about 5% of GDP, largely relying on quantitative measures. But second was a very prudent recalibration of government spending on the part of the fiscal authorities, which injected a lot of cash, as in the Asas cash program, as I mentioned, but it curbed the fiscal deficit because Pakistan already had a high level of public debt, and therefore It supported market sentiment when investors see that unlike emerging markets, where on average public debt to GDP grew by about 10% of GDP, in Pakistan it was broadly unchanged in 2020. And for a country that had macro imbalances previously, this calibrated response, a combination of prudent fiscal and aggressive monetary, is one of the key factors that underpins the economic turnaround and the increase in growth to about 4%.
Governor, earlier you talked about how you're monitoring inflation. Inflation is already at the higher end for the fiscal year. What's the target? What are you looking at in the coming year?
We announced a forecast for inflation several months ago of 7 to 9% on average for this fiscal year that closes at the end of June. Our most recent estimate is that it will be close to the top end of that range. So the range being 7 to 9, and we now think that it will end up on average closer to 9%. The most recent print on inflation is around 11%. A few months ago, it was around 6%. We decomposed this and found that 3/4 of this increase in inflation recently is concentrated in just a handful of commodities or CPI groups pertaining to energy and food. So we largely see this as one-off, but we are prepared, as I mentioned, to take any action if there are signs of demand pressure, but currently we don't see any.
I just want to get, Governor, to your reserves and the parlous nature of the current account that Pakistan does have. A country which has been to the IMF more than many others. Do you have to renegotiate the latest package that you have, or do you have to actually negotiate with somebody else as well, such as partners in the Middle East and China as well?
The IMF program right now is in a stage of pivoting from stabilization to growth. In most IMF programs, Rishaad, and I worked with the IMF for 18 years before quitting and joining our central bank, that is the transition that takes place. Pakistan has successfully demonstrated that it has stabilized. Our current account deficit, Rishaad, was about $19 billion. And today, in the first in the first 3/4 of the fiscal year, it's close to $900 million surplus. So a deficit of 19 billion converted to a surplus of 900. Our reserves were about 7.2 billion on our balance sheet when we started the IMF program. Today, they're in the range of 16 billion. So the increase is more than double the starting amount. And this is also the increase in net international reserves, meaning that these reserves have been grown not by borrowing, but by high quality measures. Now, pivoting to growth is critical for any national economic program because you have to demonstrate that the gains of stabilization are going to come to the people in the form of growth. That's the stage where we are. And I think the 4% revised forecast of growth demonstrates that this policy has been successful.